Welcome to Happy Talks with Dr. Alice and Donovan. Dr. Alice Fong is a holistic naturopathic doctor and founder of Amor de Soi Wellness. And Donovan Jensen is a software engineer and founder of HowToHappy.com. Together, they're out to cause more happiness in the world.
Hello, welcome to Happy Talks. My name is Dr. Alice, and this is my awesome co-host, Donovan. And today we are going to be talking about crying. Yes, crying, a thing that we've probably all experienced at some point, maybe some more than others. But yeah, Donovan, do you want to start the conversation off about your thoughts or experiences with crying?
Yeah, so just at a surface level, I haven't done a whole lot of work or thought around crying, but clearly it's a very normal and natural part of the human experience. From my perspective, since I haven't done that much work around it, I still feel a lot of pressure or a lot of these like ingrained thought patterns around like, oh, like men aren't supposed to cry, or crying is just like a breakdown of some sort of emotional control or something like that. And while I don't, if I think about it for a second, I don't believe those things. Since I haven't done a lot of work in the area, those patterns still come up very strong when I start thinking about it, or if I have experiences that like lead me to crying. That's some of my initial thoughts. What about on your end?
Yeah, before I talk about my own experiences, I do have some curious questions just from, I love the male perspective on, like, when you feel maybe the possibility of crying or maybe the urge to cry, is this like little voice in your head say, don't cry, boys don't cry, like resisting you? And do you just learn to ignore that voice, or do you just be like, oh, well, now I don't feel like crying? What's your experience?
Yeah, so I think for me, when sort of that feeling arises, it's not so much a voice of, hey, you're not supposed to do this. It's more a voice of like, this is not a valuable use of time. You need to look at what it takes to solve whatever this problem is, or to step into some other space to unwind or like let your emotional buildup sort of subside a little bit. So it's less direct sort of than what you're talking about, but still the subtext is there of like, oh, I shouldn't be crying. Or like I even said, like sometimes the thought is there, like, this is not a useful thing to do. Whereas from a physiological perspective, I don't know that that's actually true. I don't know that much about it. Like I said, I haven't done that much work on it, but I imagine there is some useful function for it. Otherwise it wouldn't exist. So it's more like that. It's more sort of like, oh, my attention is drifting this way. No, I'm going to force it over into this direction.
Yeah, I could understand that. For my own experience, I've noticed an evolution in my crying experiences, in that I would say perhaps because of my upbringing, I don't feel like I cried too frequently because it was frowned upon. I guess it's like, you're not supposed to cry or express negative emotions. But as I've grown and developed, I've learned that it is, for me, at least I can speak for myself, it is more of a cathartic release. And I know it's just kind of like just allowing my emotions to be and just accepting it and letting it pass through me rather than trying to like shove the emotion away and down. And I can talk about experiences like when I broke up with my college boyfriend. I did cry a lot, but it was in the privacy of my own home where no one could see me. Like, it was late at night, crying myself to sleep every night, but through the day, nobody could tell that anything was wrong with me, that I was perfectly fine and functional. And, I get that some people, we do need to get through our day to day and work and live and all that. But I think we need to also create space for those emotions. So there is space. I think there does need to be space. Now I feel like that I've done a lot of personal development. My ability to express my emotions have expanded. I don't know if I'd say it's changed. It's expanded, in my opinion. And now I can easily cry from like a sad ending of a movie, like super easy. And I don't, maybe it's also letting go of the fear of what people think too. in that I don't care anymore. Like, yeah, my husband sees me cry all the time. I really don't care. Plenty of people have seen me cry. I've cried in front of like 200 people before. So it's happened, and I've kind of feel like it's been nice because it gives me a sense of freedom to just be me and express my emotions as they come.
I think the piece I want to hone in on is sort of this social aspect of it, because I think from my experience, that's part of what makes it so that I have historically wanted to focus on or do something else. Not because the act of crying itself is something that I inherently feel like is like, oh no, I shouldn't be doing this, but because the social repercussions of that in a number of different ways are not ones necessarily that I want to deal with. Now, my social circles and situations are different than they have been in the past, but you know, for me, like you were saying, if first of all, I don't experience the urge to cry very often. It's not a common occurrence to me, which is why I haven't done much work around it. Is just because it's not something that happens to me very often.
Right.
But the times that it does happen, I generally just want to be left alone. But there's enough of an expression that people around you are going to react in some way, most likely. And especially the people who actually know me and know me well and know that that's not something I express very often. So essentially, one of the things that I dislike, or one of the things that has pushed me away from sort of expressing that, even in the rare moments that it does come up, is that I don't want to deal with all this extra like, oh, let me like, oh, what are we gonna do? Why are you so sad? What's wrong? Blah, 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 all these other things. When if I'm at that point, I'm just trying to sort of express or like emote in a way to let off some of the emotions that I have, as opposed to it's not me asking for help, right? It's not a way for me of communicating, hey, I want extra attention on this right now. So that just made that a little bit more clear for me, as one of the reasons that I typically have moved away from it in the past.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think, I do have to agree that there's probably more judgment and stigma for a man to cry than a woman typically. And so it would seem more abnormal, I guess, to people to see, someone of the male gender crying when they don't frequently do that. So they go into the fix it mode, which I've I have had friends do that too, where they're like, oh, what can I do? What can I do to support you? And I just have to communicate, obviously, that, sometimes I'm not in the mood for that. All I need is like a hug. And I've had to kind of like train the people around me to give me what it is that I need in those moments. But I can understand that it can be challenging if people are kind of caught off guard by someone crying who doesn't frequently cry. Yes.
Yeah, and I think that another piece of it is, I mean, I don't know how often you cry or what that experience is like for you, but since it's so infrequent, the times that I am crying, I must be really overwhelmed, or like something is very out of the usual for me.
Yeah.
So I have not strengthened or practiced the muscles around communicating appropriately what I do need in those moments. Now maybe I'll remember this conversation, and now that we focused on it a little bit, and be able to do it next time. But I think that's another piece of the problem, is just like I was saying, when those instances are happening, I'm so far down that rabbit hole that I really don't want the extra attention. I'm just having whatever sort of this expression is. But I think that's a very useful and important thing, is to recognize that obviously if people are giving you attention because you're crying, they want to try to help in some way. And if the most helpful thing is to, just be present and you communicate that, then most people are going to be able to accept that and move on. But if you don't, or at least from what I've seen, people will ask like, oh, what about this? What about this? Can I do this? Should I do this? Do you want this? Which again, in my experience, is more of a pain than it is helpful.
Yeah, I can understand that. Yeah. I am curious, like, what's a frequency? I feel like I do, as far as going back, kind of jumping back to the idea of frequency, And it really varies significantly. And maybe it's like, oh, I watched 3 really sad movies in a row. I'll cry for all 3 potentially. I could cry 3 times in a week. But I'd say lately, I can't even remember the last time I cried. It's probably been at least a few months where it does feel like something more dramatic has to happen in my life for me to get that urge. But I do know when I was involved in more, not necessarily bad things, but just like more intensive life situation stuff, I was crying a lot more frequently, maybe because it was like witnessing other people in pain or suffering that will make me cry. And so doing that type of work would make me cry. I've cried after being with a patient that was really struggling and suffering. So yeah, it could be like a few times a week. It could be like once every 3 months or so. It really varies for me, but it's interesting because before I met my husband, he hadn't cried in 6 years since his grandmother died. And he actually, thanks to me and my emotional personal development, I've imparted and, helped him uncover and explore different avenues and realizing that he has emotions. For one, didn't realize he had emotions when we first met, which was funny to me. He's become more in tune, and he doesn't cry very frequently, very rarely, but during more like, we have broken up before and in our relationship, and yeah, that's a crying type of incident. I definitely cried from that, or just like other major life events that have happened. But typically, if we're in just like a routine and day to day, yeah, that we don't usually bawl our eyes out unless but he makes fun of me when I am always like tearing up at the end of like a sad movie, because I feel my feelings, but he just kind of laughs at me. So, yeah, that's what happens.
I think that leads nicely into sort of a conversation around intensity, right? I feel like there's different intensity of crying,
right?
And I also feel like it means different things to different people. Because like my grandma, for example, she cries about everything, every single thing. Like seriously, it's my family also makes fun of her a lot because she just cries at like, I don't know, like someone crosses the street and then she'll just like cry because like, I don't know what. But it doesn't mean she's in like deep emotional despair.
Yeah.
Whereas, some of the people in my life, particularly like some of the men in my family and whatnot, like if they're crying, they are having a very serious negative emotional experience.
Yeah.
So I think that's actually another important thing to like maybe talk about a little bit more and expand on, is just like different levels of intensity and what crying means for people.
Yeah, that would be interesting to explore, because I think it is a different experience when I'm just like crying from a sad movie or something external like TV. Or I just remembered the last time I cried was watching This Is Us, which is just like in show that makes you cry. How do you not cry? and Jack, the main character's mother, passed, and he was just crying, and I cried. So it's that. But then there's like the crying within my own personal experiences of something I'm dealing with. But then there's crying over something difficult that someone I care about is dealing with. Is different layers of it, and they can all be similar but also different in a lot of ways. And I'm trying to kind of evaluate how it's, which one is more intense for me. I think sometimes, honestly, when it's someone I love that's suffering, it almost sometimes feels more intense for me, because I think I'm like, I can brush off my own stuff, like put it to the side. But when it's someone else, I feel like I can't do anything about it. That's hard for me.
Do you think that's the core of the depth of the feeling is how much control you have over it? Or do you think it's strictly other people?
Not necessarily. I think it's more of like the degree that they're in pain or suffering is the bigger determinant. Yeah.
I guess do you feel like it's like a multiplier though? Like, do you feel like control is one of the factors that makes it worse or better?
I guess it is a factor, but just kind of reflecting on the idea of it, I don't feel like I generally have any control in those situations most of the time, except to be like a supportive ear or shoulder to lean on kind of a thing. That's all I can do. And I've learned to not like go into fix it mode for those people when they're in the emotional pain, to just be there, to be present with them, and just to be of support and make sure that they feel heard and understood. I think that's a skill that I've honed and developed over time, and I realize that's sometimes all I can do. Yeah.
On another angle, I was thinking of another question. Have you had the experience of crying from happiness?
Oh, yeah. I did think of this topic too, as far as the crying realm that we're discussing. I definitely have cried from laughing so hard, just being so happy. More like not being so happy. Well, I don't know. Yeah, I think there's difference. There's crying from laughing so hard, crying from being happy, where something like really amazing happened and it just like the emotion and people are like, why are you crying? And it's like, no, it's happy tears. I've had that experience. It's way less common. I think when I'm just really happy, it's more just smiles and glee, and my face gets sore after smiling so much. Versus, although I think like crying from sadness is definitely like the most frequent and common. Then it's like crying from laughing seems like the second tier down, where I do like to laugh, and if it's funny enough, I'll definitely laugh very hard, and cry from it, which is always a great experience. And then crying from happiness without necessarily laughing, just being joyful, seems like the bottom tier that doesn't happen as frequently, although it's a great experience, but it doesn't seem as common.
Yeah, the reason I asked is because I don't know that I have experienced that ever. Now, I'm not saying that for sure, but I really can't remember a time. And so the follow-up that I had to that is I think crying from laughing is a little bit different, because part of it's like just your face getting all scrunched up forever. And anyway, the question that I wanted to ask was around, do you think it's related to like being overwhelmed with emotion of a certain type, whether positive or negative, that results in crying? Or if not, like, what do you think the difference is between the happy and sad version of crying? Because again, it's not an experience that I have had.
I think it is kind of an outward overly expression, or not, I wouldn't say overly, but just like the extreme expression of happiness. And when you cry, it's more not necessarily, I don't want to say extreme, but just like, you could be sad and not cry, but if you're crying from sadness, then you're really, really sad. But if you're crying from happiness, then you're really, really happy. Not just happy, you're really, really happy. So I think it's just like an expanded version of the outward expression of both emotions, good or bad. And I think both are great in a sense, and not super common, because I think a lot of people don't necessarily develop themselves emotionally to even understand what it would take to get to that point, potentially. Because I could say how I am today versus how I was 15, 20 years ago is very different. And I do feel like I'm more expressive. I feel my feelings more, but I attribute that to a lot of the work I've done. But, if you told, Alice from 15 years ago, like, oh, you're just, you just don't cry, or you're just not that expressive a person, they just like box them into that identity. Like that's how they are, and they'll never be any different. I think that's a disservice to people in that, and maybe they won't be different, but I just know that it's possible to evolve and grow and change in your emotional expression over time. Yeah.
Well, I have a lot of questions today, but I want to still go onto that note. When you say that sort of, you were able to develop more emotional expressiveness,
Mhm.
Specifically in regards to sadness, I guess I'm not fully grasping what the difference is between past you and current you, right? So
Right.
past you might do something and current you probably does something else. I would be curious to get like maybe an example or something of like how you feel that expressiveness has grown. Because for me personally, I feel like I've developed more emotional awareness, but the way that I express all of that, it still feels exactly the same to me. Like I haven't experienced any change in my actual emotions, but I've gotten a lot better at identifying and communicating the things that I am feeling. So
Mhm.
I'd be curious, sort of for you, what that development or growth has looked like.
Mhm. Well, definitely a part of that is being able to identify them, but I don't know exactly, I think it's an accumulation of a lot of the things that I've done where it's more of like the feelings just feel more intense. Or I mean, I can have like I feel like I don't know how to describe it. It's like, okay, this is my circle of emotional expression in a way. And then over time, it's like expanded where I can have more extreme sadness, I can have more extreme happiness, I can have more extreme anger. I'm way more expressive when I'm angry. Like back in like 15 years ago, Alice, or even teenage Alice, was not very, people didn't understand when I was angry with them or upset with them, or I didn't even fully aware that I was upset with like having that experience and that emotion. But now when I'm angry, it's very obvious, it's very apparent. I
Hmm.
get it's very like clear. I can yell sometimes when I'm really upset. No hitting. I'm not that extreme, but I definitely am more like animated, I think, in that sense. Uh and I don't know if it's getting over the I think part of it is getting over the like fear of what people might think, or like the social considerations. I've kind of, maybe that's part of my emotional development. It's like getting over like, who cares whatever people think. I could just I feel my feelings and I'm not gonna apologize for them. Part of it's that, but I think it's also just being in the practice of it. And I don't think it was just like a light switch where I'm like super not angry expressive at all, and then all of a sudden I'm like blowing my top all the time. I think it was like a gradual increase, and as I get more comfortable with feeling those feelings, I just like expand the experience a little bit more each time. And so I've gotten to a point where it's just kind of like expanded, where I can get to the extremes more easily, when I didn't even realize I had access to them before. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. It sounds to me, and you can tell me if I'm way off, but
Yeah.
it sounds to me sort of previously through some mechanism that may or may not be clear, you were sort of tamping down the emotions to some degree in a number of ways. First, like in the way you actually felt them, but also in the way that you sort of expressed it through your body, through your language,
Mhm.
through everything, because that original filter of like whatever it was to reduce the emotions was in place. And
Mhm.
as that's sort of come off, and probably some of that is what other people are going to think, and feeling comfortable expressing certain emotions and whatnot, then you were able to um, feel the things more, and then more naturally through allowing yourself to feel the things more, your body language and your communication and your expressions, all those things sort of line up more with how you feel. I don't know if that maps, but that's sort of what I was picking up.
Yeah, no, I think you um gave a good summary of what I was trying to get across. I just thought of another idea of like, it's kind of like I've built up a emotional muscle by doing it. It's like each time I cry, it's like I'm doing a rep, emotional bicep curl rep in a way. And now I've like built up my emotional muscles. I guess is the way I describe it now, in a way. Yeah.
So, following up on that again, do
Yeah.
you feel like when you do something
Mhm.
like cry, because I imagine at some points in your past life you cried as well,
Sure.
do you feel like it's a better experience in some way, or does it feel the same? Or I would just be curious, like, how that has changed, if it has changed at all.
That's a great question. And reflecting back, I would say when I think about when I was crying from, breaking up with my college boyfriend, where it was like alone late at night in my own room as I was trying to go to bed, like by myself, I remember that feeling really terrible. But now when I think about when I do cry, the majority of the time it actually feels good to me. It feels like it's what my body kind of needed to get that release in a way. It made me like that cathartic feeling, like I know I need to cry right now, and it just kind of giving myself permission to do so. So it generally, I think for the most part, it feels good. And I think it's also the thing where it doesn't feel uncomfortable for me. So there's like, I guess the mental barrier that's like, oh, it's not a good time to cry. You should be doing something else. You should like that's been like the threshold has diminished significantly. So it's just easier to get there in a way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It also maps onto some of my experience, at least the piece around when I used to cry, I used to beat myself up about it a lot, or not necessarily even that, but I would just have a lot more of spend a lot more time thinking about it and just being like, well, why did I cry and why couldn't I figure it out, and like, why was I overwhelmed? Whereas now it's a lot more acceptance. Sometimes it's still like, I'm gonna cry over this. Okay, I guess we'll let that run its course. There's still a little bit of judgment, but it's not it's not nearly as heavy-handed as it used to be. But I think, at least for me, that's been part of the experience of growth, is just being more comfortable going like expressing that emotion and allowing space for it. I had another question for you, which was, have you ever experienced sort of having the urge to cry or the feeling to cry, but not having a clear reason or knowing the reason?
Yes, I've had that experience. I think part of it could be we do have to factor in. I think a lot of the times when we cry, it's like situational, like what's going on in our lives or someone else that we care about's lives. And I do think there's like a hormonal component too, potentially, that just like out of the blue, I don't know if it was like PMS or just kind of I couldn't identify, or I do know of situations. I think it does happen very rarely, once in a while out of the blue, where I can't quite identify what's the thing. But then there's another situation where it's nothing like major that's happening to me. It's just like the accumulation of like a bunch of little things where it just adds up, like this thing went wrong, this went bad, and then I just feel overwhelmed. Nothing's going right. It's nothing like nobody died, but I just want to cry because I'm just upset that everything is going wrong, kind of a thing too. So that's a different experience, but I can identify that's the thing that's causing me to cry. It's the accumulation of a bunch of the little things versus like not knowing exactly what's causing me to cry, which is rare, but it has happened on occasion where I'm like, why am I? Oh, I was trying to remember of a time when that's happened. And I just remembered the time was when I was doing the miracle morning routine with my partner. And we would like wake up and meditate and drink water and exercise for at least 10 minutes a day. It's just part of our morning ritual. And we were doing this around November, and we were pretty good and on track with this routine for like 3 weeks. And I was feeling great. And then we fell off the wagon. It was like the holidays. And I remember like there was nothing wrong, but I just felt like sad. I needed to cry. And then I was like, oh, I fell out of my routine. Maybe that has contributed to my mood shift. That could be like the thing. And I think it was like I wasn't doing my routine that like, exercise, meditation is all great for your mood and your energy levels. And I realized when I fell off the routine, it was just like a day or two after, I was just like, why do I feel sad? There's nothing wrong going on. And I do attribute it to that. And that when you fall out of, like, I think it's important to maintain healthy habits to optimize your mood more of the time, to improve it, obviously.
Yeah, I definitely think that's correct, right? Like if you're doing a bunch of things to keep your mood up and then you stop doing them.
Yeah. And it's like, what's going on?
My experience has been a little bit different, which is there have been times where I've felt the urge to cry and not really known why. A couple times it's been like back in the past when I wasn't as in touch with my emotions and I was getting overwhelmed, or kind of like you were saying, like everything was building up and then one small thing. A couple times it's been that, like I haven't been able to identify some of the things.
Yeah.
But one other major experience I've had is sometimes that will flag to me that a depressive spell is going to start. I think we've talked about this before. I've had depression on and off, and something that is mostly off these days, but I used to have a lot more. However, when I would have spells, or when I have spells, I'm sure it'll happen sometime in the future. That eventually I learned was one of the signs or things for me to pay attention to, signaling like, hey, you might be heading towards depression. Nowadays, if something like that happens, I make sure to really get super tight on all my stuff, like sleep and my diet and exercise, and have people around me and stuff. And most of the time I can kind of not deal with it, or deal with it at a much more minor level. But in the past, when I used to have that urge and I could not pinpoint where it came from at all, a lot of times it was related to, well, you're about to be depressed for a month, so good luck. And when I wasn't paying attention to that signal, or when I was mostly just like confused, or like, okay, I'm just sitting in a car driving, like it's not a thing to cry about. When I wasn't paying attention to it, then I would just continue whatever my normal behaviors were, which didn't always include health behaviors, and it could lead to a big depression spell. So that's just one other thing I wanted to flag, because for me, in my experience, that is something for me to really take note of, as it has a big chance of changing my quality of life in the near future.
Yeah, no, I think you bring up a really important point, that it's important to recognize that, like, the feeling of crying, or the urge to cry, I would say it's like a signal from your body saying, like, there's something off, or there's something that's going on, that you really need to, like, tune into yourself, and like have some awareness of, like, and maybe this is learned over time and becoming more in tune with yourself, to be able to identify, okay, this might be like leading into like a depressive spell, or maybe something else. So I think it's good to pay attention, instead of like ignoring the signal, to just kind of like tune in, to be like, hey, without like the like iron fist of like, we need to figure this out right now, but just a more of a curiosity approach of like, what does this mean? Yeah, this is something going on in my life that I need to be paying attention to. Or yeah, how do I really feel about like this thing that's going on right now?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because it took me a long time to learn that, because there were times that it would happen and then nothing would come of it, right? Because I'd probably stick with whatever health behaviors I was doing, and then it would work out. So then I would just have this moment, or this instance of like, what the hell was that? Like, why was I about to cry at a ladybug on the street? Okay, strange. But over time, by sort of piecing together those patterns, and as we've been talking about, doing more work around trying to be really mindful and tune into my emotions and stuff like that, it really helped me unlock something that's been very useful for my life. So like you mentioned, it's definitely a signal worth tuning into and paying attention to if it comes up.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, I think we covered this topic pretty well. Was there any final thoughts that you had?
Nope.
All right, great. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. We appreciate you listening in. Be sure to write in the comment section if you're on YouTube, experience where you've cried, your thoughts about crying if you'd like. And be sure to follow, subscribe, like, share, all the good things that help spread the happiness. This is Donovan and Alice, and we appreciate you. We'll see you next time. Bye, guys.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please take a second to subscribe as it really helps out a lot. If you're looking for more content, there's all sorts of information over at howtohappy.com. And if you want something a little bit more condensed and concise, I've also written the book Mindscaping, which is essentially a framework for optimizing happiness. So we'll have the link there as well. And that's all I've got. Thanks again. I'll see you next time.